The evening started like any other, or so I thought. The house was quiet. A soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the background, as I threw my keys onto the entryway table. I'd been working late again. Another project that stretched into the night, but I was used to it. That's what life had become. A routine where work came first, and everything else seemed to follow a distant second. I couldn't remember the last time Emma and I had a meaningful conversation, or even just spent time together without the distractions of our daily lives pulling us in separate directions. I walked through the living room, glancing at the empty couch where we used to sit together, lost in conversation or laughter. Now, the TV remote lay forgotten on the coffee table, and the air between us seemed thicker than it had been in a long time. I sighed, taking a deep breath and shaking off the weight of the day. I thought about heading into the kitchen to grab a bite, but the silence around me felt oppressive, and for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to go any further. Something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. I called out for Emma, my voice cutting through the stillness. "Ing, you home?" From the hallway, I heard her reply, her tone distracted but warm. "Yeah, I'm here." I walked toward the sound of her voice, pushing open the door to the bedroom. She was sitting on the bed, her phone in her hand. Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressed together as she typed a message. She didn't look up as I entered, but I didn't think much of it. She'd been a bit distant lately, but we both were, caught in the usual grind of life. It didn't seem out of the ordinary, but as I took in the sight of her, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes focused entirely on her phone, an odd feeling settled in my chest. Something wasn't right. I watched her for a moment, trying to decide whether to interrupt. I wanted to ask her about her day, to connect, but I wasn't sure how. I hadn't been able to connect in what felt like forever. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, I heard a soft sound from the other side of the room. It was the sound of Emma's voice. Only this time it wasn't directed at me. "I just can't stand him anymore," she said, her voice almost a whisper but clear enough for me to hear. "Everything he does drives me crazy." I froze. It wasn't the first time I'd overheard bits of conversations. Emma was often on the phone with her best friend, Sarah, or one of her family members. But this felt different. The tone in her voice wasn't the one she used when she was venting about minor annoyances or frustrations. No, this was something deeper, something more serious. I stood there, paralyzed by her words. "Everything he does drives me crazy." I couldn't believe it. I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach as the weight of her words settled in. Was she talking about me? I had no doubt she was. But why? What had I done that had brought her to this point? I had known, of course, that things weren't perfect between us, but I never thought it was this bad. I turned away, instinctively trying to hide my presence. I didn't want her to know I had heard. It felt wrong, eavesdropping on a private conversation. But as I stood there trying to make sense of what I had just heard, I couldn't help myself. I needed to know more. "She's just so distant now," Emma continued, her voice quivering slightly. "I feel like I'm living with a stranger, like we're not even the same people we were when we first met." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my breath quicken, my chest tightening. I knew things had been different lately, but I hadn't realized how bad it had gotten. We hadn't been communicating. I hadn't been there for her in the way she needed. I could feel the weight of all the unspoken words between us crashing down. How had I let it get this far? Why hadn't I noticed sooner? I don't know what to do anymore," Emma said, her voice barely audible now. I could tell she was on the verge of tears. "I love him, but I don't know if I can keep living like this." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. My heart was racing, and I felt a knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to run to her, to take her in my arms and apologize for everything. I wanted to tell her that I'd been struggling too, that work had consumed me, that I hadn't realized how much I had been neglecting her. But instead, I stood there motionless, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Emma let out a long, shaky breath. "I think I need space. I don't know if I even want to try anymore." Space. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. Was that what she wanted? Was she giving up on us? I couldn't fathom the idea. The thought of losing her, of losing everything we had built together, was unbearable. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that things had already been falling apart for a long time. We were two people drifting in opposite directions, too afraid or too proud to reach out and pull each other back. I had always been good at ignoring problems, pushing them aside until they grew too big to avoid. And now, standing in the doorway, overhearing Emma's words, I realized that I had done exactly that with our marriage. I had failed her in ways I hadn't even understood. She needed me, and I hadn't been there for her. In a daze, I walked out of the room, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay. I couldn't face her after hearing those words, after knowing how badly I had let her down. What could I say? How could I explain all the ways I had failed her? I wasn't sure I could. I found myself grabbing my keys, my coat, and heading out the door without a plan or destination in mind. I needed to leave. I needed space too. My mind was racing, filled with a mixture of guilt, confusion, and a sense of betrayal. It wasn't just her words that hurt. It was the realization that I didn't even know my own wife anymore. We had become strangers to each other, and I couldn't remember how we got here. I didn't even leave a note at first. I just drove, letting the miles between us grow, hoping that distance would give me clarity, that it would somehow make me understand what had gone wrong. I ended up at a friend's place on the outskirts of the city, unsure of what I was looking for but feeling that I couldn't return home. Not like this. As I sat on the couch staring at the blank wall, I realized I hadn't thought things through. I hadn't considered what Emma would feel, what she would think. I just reacted. In that moment, I was a man running from his own problems, too afraid to confront them head-on. I had heard her say she couldn't stand me, and it was as if everything in my world shattered in that instant. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I laid awake, replaying her words over and over again in my head. Everything I had been too blind to see. The distance, the frustration, the resentment came flooding in. How had I allowed us to drift this far apart? How had I become the kind of husband she couldn't stand? In the silence of the night, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to that house, to that life, without understanding what had happened, without knowing if there was still a chance for us. I had to find the courage to face the truth, whatever it might be. And maybe, just maybe, if I disappeared long enough, Emma would realize how much I meant to her. But even as I thought that, I couldn't help but wonder if I had already lost her for good. The first few days were disorienting. I woke up in a spare bedroom at my friend's place, the unfamiliar space surrounding me feeling cold and impersonal. The room was neat, but there was nothing about it that felt like home. The bed was too small, the walls too bare, the air too still. I kept expecting to hear Emma's voice, or feel the familiar comfort of her presence, but there was nothing. It felt like a void had opened up inside me, one that I couldn't fill no matter how much I tried to occupy my mind. I was alone with my thoughts, and they were relentless. I hadn't planned on leaving. The decision to pack a bag and just disappear had been impulsive, fueled by a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. I didn't know what I was trying to achieve. I didn't know if I was running from the situation or trying to force some kind of reaction from Emma. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. I couldn't look her in the eye after hearing what I had. I couldn't be in that house, in that marriage, when it felt like everything I knew was crumbling. The first day was the hardest. The numbness I'd felt when I left quickly turned into a gnawing anxiety. I thought about Emma constantly, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Was she angry? Was she relieved? Had she even noticed I was gone? The uncertainty was unbearable. I told myself it was for the best, that I needed to give her space and time to think. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding something. I wasn't just giving her space. I was running away from the confrontation that was inevitable. I spent the day walking around, trying to distract myself. I went to a cafe, ordered coffee, and sat by the window, staring blankly at the people passing by. I felt disconnected from everything, as if I were watching my life unfold from a distance. I kept wondering if Emma had tried to call me, if she was looking for me. I kept telling myself that I'd call her tomorrow, that I'd figure things out. But every time I reached for my phone, something held me back. The thought of hearing her voice, her disappointment, her anger, her sadness, made me hesitate. By the time the evening came, I realized I had done nothing but think about Emma. I hadn't made any decisions. I hadn't figured out what I was going to do. I was stuck in this limbo, neither here nor there, waiting for something to shift. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like a coward. I had left without saying a word to her, without explaining myself, without giving her any indication of why I'd just vanished. She had to be confused, maybe even terrified. I lay in the bed that night, tossing and turning, my thoughts spinning in circles. I could hear the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity. It was only then that I realized how much I missed the familiar sounds of our home. The sound of Emma moving around in the kitchen, the soft hum of her voice as she sang along to whatever song was playing in the background. I missed the quiet moments we shared, even when we weren't talking. The thought of losing all of that hit me harder than I'd expected. By the time morning came, I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I needed to do something. But what? I couldn't just show up at the door, not without an explanation. I couldn't just pretend everything would go back to normal. I decided to text Emma. It was a simple message, one that I hoped would open the door for conversation, for healing. I wanted to tell her that I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to hurt her. But I was still too afraid to reach out directly. Instead, I wrote, "I need to talk. I'm sorry. Can we figure this out?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my mind. The silence between us felt suffocating, but I wasn't sure if this message would even make a difference. Maybe it was too late. Maybe she didn't want to talk to me. Maybe, just maybe, the damage was too deep to repair. I hesitated for a moment longer before hitting send. As the message was delivered, I felt a pang of anxiety. There was no going back now. I had opened the door, but I didn't know what would happen next. The hours that followed felt endless. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a reply that never came. I told myself that she was probably busy, that she needed time. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't going to respond at all. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she was done with me. I couldn't stop the flood of thoughts that kept rushing through my mind. That night, I went to bed feeling empty. The silence was unbearable, but it was all I had. I had reached out, and now it was in her hands. I couldn't do anything more. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I spent hours replaying the events that had led up to this point. The argument we'd had the week before, the long periods of silence between us, the way she'd pulled away without saying a word. How had I missed it? How had I failed to notice the warning signs? Why hadn't I done something sooner? The next morning, I woke up feeling restless. I checked my phone immediately, hoping for a message, but there was nothing. I tried calling Emma, but it went straight to voicemail. My stomach churned as I left a message. "Hey, it's me. I don't know if you're ignoring me or if you just need more time, but I really want to talk. I'm sorry for leaving like that. I don't know what I was thinking, but I don't want to lose you. Please just call me when you can." I hung up feeling foolish. What if she didn't call back? What if she never wanted to speak to me again? The thought of her rejecting me, of her telling me she was done, was almost more than I could bear. I sat down on the couch, my head in my hands, consumed by the silence that had grown between us. Days passed, each one feeling like an eternity. I found myself constantly distracted, unable to focus on anything. I tried to work, but it felt hollow. I tried to go out with friends, but even their company couldn't distract me from the pain of not knowing what was happening with Emma. I had left her, but now it felt like I was losing myself too. The person I had been without her wasn't someone I recognized. I didn't know who I was anymore. Every time I looked at my phone, I was filled with a mixture of hope and dread. I kept wondering if she had tried to reach out, but the truth was I hadn't given her much of a chance. I had left without explanation, without giving her the opportunity to talk things through. And now I was paying the price for it. I went to bed that night wondering if I was making a mistake by waiting for her to reach out. What if she needed me to show up to prove that I was serious about fixing things? What if I was too passive in this whole thing? Too afraid to take the first step? The thought of losing her, of seeing her move on without me, filled me with a deep, gnawing fear. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what she needed from me. All I knew was that the silence was killing me. It was suffocating, like I was waiting for something that might never come. And then, just as I was about to resign myself to the idea that things might be over, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt in my chest. I picked it up, not caring if it was a call or a message. I just needed something, anything to break the silence. It was a text from Emma. "We need to talk. I don't know if we can fix this, but we need to try." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Was this it? Was this the start of something new? Or was it just the beginning of the end? I didn't know, but for the first time in days, I felt like I had a chance. The message from Emma that night was brief but clear. "We need to talk. I don't know if we can fix this, but we need to try." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart race, to make my stomach twist with both relief and dread. For days I had been living in a constant state of uncertainty, trapped in the silence between us, questioning if this was the end or the beginning of something. And now, finally, it seemed like we had a chance, small, fragile, but there. But as I read the message over and over again, my mind filled with doubt. What did she mean by "we need to try"? Was this just a polite way of saying that she was done but wanted closure? Or was it an invitation to rebuild, to fight for something that had once been beautiful? I didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. I had to see her. I had to speak to her in person, not just over a text or a phone call. The next morning, I woke up early, my nerves already on edge. I had barely slept. The weight of the last few days hung over me like a cloud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. Every second I waited felt like another moment slipping away, another piece of our relationship falling apart. I had no idea what Emma was thinking, but I couldn't let her slip through my fingers without at least trying to understand what had gone wrong. I grabbed my phone and started typing a response, but my fingers hovered over the screen for a long time. What was I supposed to say? How could I explain what I had done, why I had disappeared without warning? I wanted to apologize, but I didn't want to come off as desperate, as though I was begging for her forgiveness. I had to find a balance between acknowledging the hurt I'd caused and showing that I was ready to face whatever came next. In the end, I kept it simple. "I'm coming over. I need to see you. We'll figure this out together." There was no point in hiding behind more words. I just needed to be there. I threw on some clothes and drove to our old neighborhood. It was a familiar route, one I had driven countless times before, but today it felt different. The streets I once knew so well now seemed foreign, as if I was driving through someone else's life. The houses we'd passed together, the coffee shop where we had our first date, the park where we'd spent lazy Sunday afternoons. All of it felt distant now, as though it belonged to a version of me that didn't exist anymore. I tried to remind myself that this wasn't the end, that there was still time to make things right, but the nagging fear lingered in the back of my mind. As I pulled into the driveway, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I could see the outline of our house through the front window, the same house we had chosen together. It had been our dream, our project. But now it felt like a relic of a past I wasn't sure I could get back to. I took a deep breath before stepping out of the car, trying to steady my nerves. I didn't know how she was going to react. Would she be angry? Would she cry? Would she even want to talk to me at all? I knocked on the door, my hand trembling slightly as it made contact with the wood. The minutes that followed felt like hours. I could hear movement inside, footsteps coming closer, and my heart began to beat faster. And then the door opened. Emma stood there, her face a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something I couldn't quite place. Her eyes were red, as if she hadn't been sleeping, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, but there was something in her gaze that made me pause. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, as though unsure of what to do. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was as if we were both trying to figure out what came next. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Finally, Emma took a step back and gestured for me to come in. "Let's talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her inside, feeling the cold air of the house press against me. The familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon was still in the air, a small comfort amidst the tension. I looked around, noticing how little had changed. The house still felt like ours, but the space between us felt vast, like an ocean I couldn't cross. We sat on the couch, both of us awkwardly avoiding eye contact at first. The weight of everything that had happened was too much to ignore, too much to just sweep aside. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt stuck in my throat. What could I say to make this right? How could I undo the hurt I had caused her by just walking away without a word? "I'm sorry," I finally said, my voice quiet. I should have never left like that. I shouldn't have disappeared. Emma's eyes flickered with something. Anger, frustration, maybe even confusion. She crossed her arms, looking at me with an expression that was a mixture of sadness and disbelief. You think you can just disappear and come back like nothing happened? She asked, her voice sharp but not as angry as I expected. I didn't know where you were. What happened? I've been calling and texting. You didn't even give me a chance to talk. I didn't know what to say, I admitted. I thought maybe you didn't want to hear from me. After what I overheard you say. I didn't want to make things worse. She stared at me for a moment, her lips pressed together. You heard that? She asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, not sure what else to say. I couldn't deny it. I had overheard her conversation, and I had reacted impulsively. I should have handled it differently, but I couldn't take it back. I didn't mean it like that, she said, her eyes softening. I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about how I felt about everything. But I didn't mean to make you feel like you were the problem. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was tempered by the guilt that lingered. Then why didn't you say something? Why didn't we talk about it before? I didn't know how to, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to tell you that I was feeling so distant, that I was drowning in everything: work, life, our relationship. I didn't know how to tell you that I felt so alone. The words hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable. I could feel the heaviness of her emotions, the weight of everything she had been carrying in silence. It hit me then. She had been hurting too, but in a way that I had been too blind to see. We had both been so caught up in our own worlds, in our own frustrations, that we hadn't realized how far apart we had grown. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice breaking slightly. I never meant to make you feel that way. I should have noticed, I should have been there for you. But instead I shut myself off. I was so focused on work, on everything else, that I didn't even see what was happening between us. Emma looked down, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. I didn't know how to reach you anymore, she said, her voice shaky. I tried, but it felt like you were slipping away from me. I didn't know what to do. I reached out, taking her hand gently in mine. I don't want to slip away, I said, my voice firm. I want to fix this. I want to do whatever it takes to make it right. She met my gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. I don't know if we can fix it, she said quietly, but I'm willing to try. Are you? I nodded, squeezing her hand. I'm here. I'm ready. And for the first time in days, the silence between us felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, a starting point for something new. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future held. But we both knew that we were willing to try. And that somehow was enough. The days after that conversation felt like a slow but steady unraveling of everything we had been. I don't know if I can fully describe the feeling, but it was like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether to jump or to pull back. There was something beautiful in the raw honesty that had passed between us, but also something terrifying. The truth had come out, and with it, the weight of all the unsaid things that had accumulated over the years. It felt like we had finally torn down the walls, only to find ourselves exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of how to rebuild what we had lost. We spent the next week talking. It wasn't easy. There were moments of silence where neither of us knew what to say. There were times when the conversation seemed to circle around itself, when it felt like we were talking in circles, rehashing the same emotions, the same regrets over and over again. But despite the difficulty, despite the pain of confronting our issues head-on, there was a sense of connection that had been missing for so long. It was as though we were finding each other again, relearning how to talk, how to be with each other. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We decided to take it slow. There were no grand gestures, no promises that things would immediately go back to the way they were. We both knew that we couldn't just erase the past, that we couldn't undo the hurt that had been caused. But we also knew that we couldn't keep living in this limbo, where every word we spoke felt like it was being weighed down by unspoken resentment. We had to do the hard work of healing, of rebuilding trust and communication. It was going to take time. One night, we sat on the couch together, our fingers intertwined, the silence between us comfortable for the first time in a long while. Emma had been quiet for a while, her eyes focused on the floor, and I could tell she was deep in thought. After a few minutes, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with both sadness and something else, something I couldn't quite place. You know, she said softly, I've been thinking about everything we've been through, about how we got to this point. And I realize now that I was waiting for you to see me. I was waiting for you to notice that I was struggling, that I was feeling overwhelmed, that I needed you. But instead I withdrew. I shut you out. I could feel a lump form in my throat as I listened to her. I didn't see it, I admitted quietly. I should have seen it. I should have been there for you, and I wasn't. I got caught up in my own stuff, and I didn't even stop to check in with you, to ask how you were doing. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a sadness I hadn't seen in a long time. I didn't ask for help either, she said, her voice trembling. I just kept thinking it was something I should handle on my own. And when I couldn't handle it, I didn't know how to tell you that I was falling apart. I felt like I was drowning. We sat in silence for a long time after that. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. For the first time, we were acknowledging the real pain that had been simmering under the surface for so long. It wasn't just the fight we had had before I left. It wasn't just the moment I overheard her words and fled. It was years of small things, unspoken feelings, unacknowledged needs that had piled up and created a chasm between us. I'm sorry, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I never wanted to make you feel like you had to go through it alone. I should have been there, and I wasn't. Emma reached out, her hand gently resting on my arm. And I should have told you. I should have let you in instead of pushing you away. I just didn't know how to ask for what I needed. We both sat there, the weight of our words hanging in the air, but for the first time it felt like we were truly listening to each other. The distance between us felt smaller, less insurmountable. It wasn't that we had all the answers, but we were willing to try again. We were willing to acknowledge the cracks in our relationship and face them head-on, instead of hiding behind them. In the days that followed, we continued to talk. We talked about our past, about the things that had brought us together, and the things that had pushed us apart. We talked about our dreams, our fears, the things we had neglected, and the things we still wanted for our future. It wasn't easy. Sometimes the conversations were raw, emotional, and difficult. But they were honest. For the first time in years, it felt like we were speaking the same language, understanding each other in a way we hadn't before. But it wasn't just words that mattered. We knew that words alone weren't enough. We had to show up for each other day after day in small ways, in meaningful ways. We started doing things together again. Simple things like cooking dinner, going for walks, watching movies, talking about our days. We made an effort to reconnect in the small ways that had once seemed so ordinary, but had now become sacred. The quiet moments we shared were beginning to feel like the foundation we could build on. We also decided to go to therapy. I didn't know if it would help, but I knew we needed more than just the conversations we were having between us. We needed guidance, tools to communicate better, to navigate the difficult terrain of rebuilding a relationship that had been broken. It wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't a magic solution that suddenly made everything better. But it gave us a framework, a way to understand each other's perspectives and needs more clearly. As weeks turned into months, the pain of the past started to fade, but the lessons it had taught us stayed with us. We both learned how to be more present, more aware of each other's emotional worlds. We learned to speak up when something wasn't right, to be vulnerable, to let each other in. And slowly we began to heal. But it wasn't a perfect process. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if we were truly going to make it. Sometimes it felt like we were still walking on fragile ground, unsure of how much weight it could bear. There were times when old patterns crept back in, when communication broke down or misunderstandings took hold. But each time we made a conscious effort to return to each other, to listen, to understand, to fix things before they had a chance to fester. There were still times when Emma would look at me, her eyes full of uncertainty, and I would remember the way it felt to overhear her words that day, the way it felt to think I had lost her. But now when she looked at me, I no longer saw the fear that had once clouded her gaze. Instead, I saw something else, something stronger, something more resilient. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I turned to her and said, "I'm glad we didn't give up." She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made something inside me relax. Me too. There were no guarantees. We couldn't predict the future. and we knew that relationships required constant effort. But in that moment I realized that the love we shared was still there. It had been buried beneath the weight of unspoken words, the burden of unmet needs, but it was still there. And it had a chance to grow again. We've still got a long way to go, I said, looking at her with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Yeah, she replied, but I think we can make it. As long as we keep trying. And for the first time in a long while I believed her. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. And that was enough. We had been through the storm, and we were still standing, together. As I took her hand, I realized that sometimes, it isn't the grand gestures or the perfect moments that define a relationship. Sometimes it's the quiet, painful moments of honesty, the willingness to face the difficult truths, and the courage to keep moving forward, no matter how uncertain the path may be. We had been tested, and we had come out on the other side, stronger for it. The future wasn't guaranteed, but we had each other. And that was all we needed.